The October wind off Lake Michigan carried the scent of decay and wet earth as Michael Henderson pushed through the dense undergrowth near the shoreline. Dead leaves crunched beneath his hiking boots, their brittle sound echoing in the silence of the forest preserve. He had been walking these trails for 20 years, but something felt different that morning. Wrong. A metallic glint caught his eye, half buried beneath a rotting log. Michael knelt his knees, sinking into the damp soil, and brushed away layers of decomposed leaves. His fingers closed around cold metal. A police badge tarnished green with age. In the fall of 1978, the tight-knit community of Chicago's 14th precinct had been shaken by the mysterious disappearance of Officer Rick Martinez. He had vanished without a trace during a routine patrol, leaving behind only his abandoned squad car and a half-finished report about drug activity in Pilsen. But 8 years later, when Detective Sarah Chen stumbles upon this cache of buried evidence, she uncovers a truth so devastating it would unravel the very fabric of a family's life and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. Michael's hands trembled as he uncovered more items. A service revolver, its serial numbers still visible despite the rust. A police radio, its plastic casing stained dark brown with what looked like dried blood. Photographs, their edges curled and yellowed, showing shadowy figures exchanging packages in narrow alleyways. And a small evidence bag, its contents rattling softly when shaken. The forest seemed to hold its breath around him. Even the birds had stopped singing. Michael pulled out his cell phone with shaking fingers, the device feeling foreign and heavy in his grip. As he dialed 911, a phrase from one of the photographs caught his eye. Writing on the back, in faded blue ink, "Tommy's medicine. Hide this." He didn't understand what it meant, not yet. But Detective Sarah Chen would, and when she did, it would change everything she thought she knew about loyalty, family, and the price of keeping secrets. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone, distant and tinny. 911, what's your emergency? Michael stared at the evidence scattered around him. 8 years of silence finally broken. "I think I found something that belongs to a dead cop." Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the forest preserve 45 minutes later, her unmarked sedan crunching over gravel in the parking area. The crime scene tape fluttered in the wind like yellow prayer flags, marking off a 10-foot perimeter around the discovery site. She pulled on latex gloves, the snap of rubber sharp against her wrists, and ducked under the barrier. Michael Henderson sat in the back of a patrol unit, his hiking jacket still damp with morning dew. His statement was clear, methodical. No embellishment, just the facts of what he'd found and when. Sarah appreciated witnesses who didn't try to insert themselves into the story. She knelt where Michael had knelt, studying the shallow depression, where 8 years of weather had tried to bury the truth. The evidence lay in careful plastic bags, now tagged and photographed. But she could still smell it, the metallic tang of old blood mixed with earth and rot. Officer Rick Martinez. Sarah pulled the file from her briefcase, its manila cover worn thin from handling. The case had been officially closed in 1983, ruled a probable homicide with no leads. Rick had been 34, married father of one. 14 years on the force, clean record commendations for community policing. On October 15th, 1978, he'd radioed in that he was investigating suspicious activity in an alley near 18th and Ashland. That was the last anyone heard from him. His squad car was found the next morning, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. His service weapon and radio were missing. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just an empty car and a half-finished incident report on the passenger seat, the pen still clipped to the notepad. Sarah studied the crime scene photographs again. Rick's badge service number 4471 still visible despite the corrosion. The radio, its plastic housing cracked but intact. And those photographs. Grainy surveillance shots of what appeared to be drug deals in progress. The small evidence bag caught her attention. She held it up to the light, watching the contents shift. Pills. Prescription pills, their labels too faded to read clearly. But there was something else inside. A small piece of paper folded tight. 8 years, Rick Martinez had been missing. 8 years, his family had lived with questions. Sarah sealed the file and stood brushing dirt from her knees. Now, those questions might finally have answers. The Martinez house sat on a quiet street in Little Village, its brown brick facade unchanged since 1978. Sarah pressed the doorbell, hearing its two-tone chime echo inside. Through the screen door's mesh, she could smell coffee and something sweeter. Cinnamon, maybe. Home smells. Safe smells. Elena Martinez answered, her once dark hair, now streaked with silver pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes held the particular weariness Sarah had seen in other long-term victims' families. Not fresh grief, but the deep exhaustion of carrying unanswered questions for too long. Mrs. Martinez, Detective Chen, thank you for seeing me. Elena led her to a living room, frozen in time. Family photographs covered every surface. Rick in his dress blues, graduation pictures, holiday gatherings. But Sarah noticed how the photos seemed to stop abruptly, somewhere in the late 70s, as if the family had forgotten how to celebrate after Rick vanished. Tommy should be here soon, Eleanor said, settling into a worn armchair. He works at the Harold Washington Library downtown, reference desk. Her voice carried the quiet pride of a mother whose child had found stability despite trauma. As if summoned by her words, footsteps echoed on the front porch. The door opened without a knock, the casual entry of someone who belonged. Tommy Martinez entered, and Sarah was struck by how ordinary he appeared. Average height, thinning brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses that he adjusted nervously as he shook her hand. His grip was soft, bookish, completely unthreatening. I heard about the discovery, Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. After all these years. It must have been terrible finding Dad's things like that. Sarah studied his face as he spoke. His eyes darted between her and his mother, never holding contact for long. Normal grief behavior, she told herself, or anxiety about reopening old wounds. I've read the case file. Tommy continued, settling onto the couch beside his mother. I mean, over the years. I've requested copies through Freedom of Information Act. I wanted to understand what happened to him. Something in his tone caught Sarah's attention. Not just sadness, but a kind of clinical detachment. As if he were discussing someone else's father. As if he'd studied the case like an academic exercise, rather than lived it as a son's nightmare. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee from a thermal carafe, the liquid steaming in the afternoon light, filtering through lace curtains. Rick had been working that corner for months, she said, settling the pot back on its warmer. 18th and Ashland. He said there was a dealer there, someone the neighborhood kids were afraid of. Sarah opened her notebook, pen poised. Marcus Webb. That's him. Elena's voice hardened with old anger. Rick arrested him twice that summer, but Webb kept getting released. Technicalities, his lawyer said. Rick was building a stronger case, gathering evidence. Tommy shifted on the couch, his finger tracing the seam of a throw pillow. I remember Dad talking about it at dinner sometimes. How Webb would stare him down when he drove past in the squad car, like he was challenging him. Sarah made notes, watching Tommy's body language. His movements seemed calculated, controlled. Not the natural fidgeting of grief, but something more deliberate. Did your father ever mention feeling threatened? Webb made it public. Elena said, her voice dropping. 3 days before Rick disappeared, Webb confronted him outside Gonzales Market. There were witnesses. Mrs. Herrera from the apartment upstairs, the Morales brothers, who worked at the auto shop. Webb got right in Rick's face and said, she swallowed hard. He said Rick better stop harassing him, or he'd make sure Rick never bothered anybody again. The threat hung in the air between them. Sarah could picture it. The drug dealer's rage, the cops' professional calm neighbours watching from windows and doorways, a public challenge that demanded a response. Webb had a reputation, Tommy added quietly, adjusting his glasses again. The kids at school, they said he'd done time upstate for assault, beat a man nearly to death with a tire iron over a $50 debt. Sarah looked up from her notes. Something about Tommy's statement nagged at her. You were in high school then? Senior year. 18. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. It was a difficult time. Dad working so much, the stress at home. I wasn't the easiest kid to handle back then. Elena reached over and squeezed her son's hand. Tommy had his struggles, a lot of teenagers do, but he got through it. The gesture was tender protective, but Sarah noticed how Tommy pulled his hand away after a moment, creating distance even from his mother's comfort. Sarah left the Martinez house with Danny Kowalski's address written on a coffee-stained napkin. Elena had provided it reluctantly, her voice dropping to a whisper as she explained that Rick's former partner lived alone now in a studio apartment near Midway Airport. He used to visit after Rick disappeared, Elena had said. But then he stopped coming. Said it was too hard. The building where Danny lived was a converted motel. Its brick facade painted an institutional green that reminded Sarah of hospital corridors. She climbed external stairs that shook under her weight, past doors marked with fading room numbers instead of apartment addresses. Danny answered her knock, wearing a bathrobe at 3 in the afternoon. His face was flushed stubble covering hollow cheeks. The smell of bourbon wafted from the doorway, mixed with stale cigarette smoke and something else. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. You're here about Rick, he said, without preamble, stepping aside to let her enter. The apartment was sparse, almost monastic. A fold-out bed, a small television, a card table serving as both desk and dining room. But Sarah noticed details that didn't fit. Expensive leather shoes, by the door a gold watch on the nightstand, a high-end stereo system that seemed out of place among the second-hand furniture. I heard they found his stuff. Danny continued, settling heavily into a plastic lawn chair. Figured somebody would come asking questions eventually. Sarah studied his hands as he spoke. They trembled slightly, but not from age or illness. These were the shakes of someone who needed his next drink, needed it badly. Tell me about October 15th, 1978. Rick went to check that alley alone. I was supposed to meet him there, but... Danny's voice trailed off. He reached for a glass on the table ice, clinking against the sides. I had other obligations that night. What kind of obligations? Danny's laugh was bitter. The kind that involve paying back money you don't have to people who don't take no for an answer. He took a long sip, his Adam's apple working. I owed some guys from Chinatown. Poker debts. Rick didn't know how bad it had gotten. Sarah made careful notes. The timeline was significant. Danny absent when his partner needed backup financial pressure that could make a man desperate enough to consider betrayal. How much did you owe? 15 grand. Might as well have been 15 million on a cop's salary. Danny stared into his drink. But I got caught up after Rick disappeared. Funny how that worked out. Sarah returned to the Martinez house that evening as streetlights flickered on across Little Village. Eleanor answered the door in a faded housecoat, her earlier composure replaced by something rawer, the exhaustion that came from a day of remembering things better left buried. "There's more," Eleanor said without greeting, leading Sarah back to the living room. "Things I didn't want to say in front of Tommy. He still idealizes his father's work, thinks all cops are heroes." The coffee table was spread with papers now. Rick's personal files kept in a shoebox for 8 years. Sarah recognized the careful organization of a cop building a case. Incident reports, witness statements, photographs of license plates, and suspicious vehicles. Rick didn't trust his own precinct, Elena said, her voice barely audible. Not toward the end. He said someone was tipping off the dealers that arrests were happening too late or with not enough evidence to stick. Sarah picked up a manila folder marked Internal Hayes. Inside were copies of duty rosters, patrol assignments, and arrest records going back 2 years. Someone had highlighted patterns in red ink, times when Sergeant Hayes had access to operational information coinciding with failed drug busts. Hayes controlled the patrol schedules, Elena continued. He knew where Rick would be when he'd be there. If someone wanted Rick silenced, the implication hung between them like smoke. Sarah studied Hayes's photograph clipped inside the folder, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and the thick moustache popular among cops in the 70s. He'd had 23 years on the force by 1978, enough seniority to cover up mistakes or crimes. Did Rick confront him? Not directly, but Hayes knew Rick was suspicious. The week before he disappeared, Rick came home late, agitated. Said Hayes had cornered him in the locker room, asked too many questions about his investigation. A door creaked upstairs. Old house settling or someone moving around. Elena glanced toward the ceiling, then back to Sarah. "Tommy's room," she explained. "Sometimes he can't sleep. All these years, and he still has nightmares about his father." Sarah made a note to ask Tommy about those nightmares. In her experience, trauma victims often remember details they didn't realize were important. Sometimes the smallest observation could crack a case wide open. Marcus Webb lived in a converted warehouse in Pilsen, its brick walls painted with murals that had faded to ghostly outlines. Sarah climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, the scent of marijuana and cooking oil growing stronger with each step. When Webb answered his door, she was struck by how small he seemed. Not the intimidating figure she'd imagined from witness descriptions, but a wiry man in his 50s with greying cornrows and hands stained permanently black from auto work. "Figured you'd show up eventually," Webb said, not inviting her inside. "Soon as I heard they found Martinez's stuff, I knew some cop would come knocking." Sarah remained in the hallway, studying his face for tells. "Where were you the night of October 15th, 1978? "Same place I told the other cops back then, playing dominoes at Rudy's Tavern on Blue Island. Was there from 8 till closing, maybe 20 people saw me." But Sarah had already checked the original investigation files during her lunch break. Webb's alibi had seemed solid in 1978, multiple witnesses placing him at the tavern during the estimated time of Rick's disappearance. However, those witnesses had been his friend's fellow dealers, people with their own reasons to lie. Rudy Castellanos died in 1982, Sarah said, watching Webb's reaction. Heart attack. But before he died, he told his nephew something interesting about that night. Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Rudy had Alzheimer's. Said a lot of things toward the end. "He said you left the tavern around 10:30. Told everyone you were going to settle a score with that cop who'd been hassling you." Sarah stepped closer, noting how Webb's breathing had quickened. "That puts you right in the time frame for Rick's disappearance." Rudy was confused. Old man's brain was going. "The nephew's willing to testify. Says Rudy was lucid when he told him about you leaving that night. Says you came back around midnight agitated, told everyone you'd taken care of that pig Martinez. Webb's composure cracked. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool afternoon air. That's bullshit. I never said nothing like that. But his eyes told a different story. Sarah had seen that look before. The particular panic of someone whose carefully constructed lies were falling apart, piece by piece. Sarah found Danny Kowalski at Murphy's pub on Archer Avenue, nursing a whiskey at the far end of the bar. The afternoon crowd was sparse. A few construction workers sharing nachos, an elderly man reading a racing form. Danny looked up as Sarah approached, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. "Knew you'd be back," he slurred, gesturing for the bartender. "Another round. Ladies buying." Sarah remained standing. "I spoke with Chen Wu today. He runs the gambling operation in Chinatown you mentioned." Danny's glass froze halfway to his lips. "Never heard of him." "He remembers you. Said you were desperate that fall, borrowing from loan sharks to cover your poker losses. Said you came to him 3 days before Rick disappeared, begging for more time." The bar's neon beer signs cast coloured shadows across Danny's face as he drained his glass. His hands shook worse now, and not just from alcohol. "So what if I did? Doesn't mean I hurt Rick." "Wu says you offered him information. Said you had access to police operations, could tip him off about raids in exchange for debt forgiveness." Danny's silence stretched too long. Behind them, a jukebox played an old Sinatra song, the crooner's voice smooth and mournful. Finally, Danny spoke. "I never gave him anything about Rick specifically." "But you gave him something." Danny's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Patrol schedules, nothing major. Just when certain areas would be light on coverage. Wu's people could move product without worrying about random patrol cars." Sarah felt the familiar surge of disgust that came with police corruption cases. "You sold out your fellow officers for gambling debts. It wasn't supposed to hurt anybody," Danny whispered. "Just shift some patrol times around. Rick wasn't even supposed to be working that sector that night." The admission hung between them like a confession. But something bothered Sarah, a detail that didn't fit. She pulled out her notebook, flipping to Rick's final patrol schedule. According to the duty roster, you're right. Rick was assigned to patrol the north end, but he went to that alley on his own. Danny looked up, confusion replacing guilt in his bloodshot eyes. "Yeah, said he got a tip about activity there. Anonymous call to the station." Sarah's pen stopped moving. Anonymous tip. In her experience, anonymous tips were rarely anonymous. They came from informants, witnesses, or people with inside knowledge. Someone had specifically directed Rick to that alley. Sergeant Frank Hayes lived in a brick ranch house in Mount Greenwood, the kind of neighborhood where Chicago cops traditionally settled when they wanted to escape the city they policed. Sarah parked across the street, noting the meticulous lawn care and the American flag hanging limp from a pole by the front door. Even in retirement, Hayes maintained the rigid order of a military man. He answered the door in pressed khakis and a polo shirt, his grey moustache neatly trimmed. At 68, he still carried himself with the bearing of authority, but Sarah caught something else in his pale eyes. Wariness, like a man who'd been expecting this conversation for years. "Detective Chen, about time somebody reopened the Martinez case." Sir, his living room was a shrine to his police career. Commendations framed on every wall, photographs of Hayes with mayors and police superintendents, a display case filled with service medals. But Sarah noticed what wasn't there. No pictures with Rick Martinez, despite their working relationship. Rick suspected someone in the precinct was leaking information to dealers, Sarah said, settling into a leather chair that creaked under her weight. "His widow says he mentioned you specifically." Hayes's jaw tightened. Rick was paranoid toward the end, saw conspiracies everywhere, good cop, but the stress was getting to him. The stress of discovering corruption in his own unit. The stress of a messy home life. Hayes leaned forward, his voice dropping. You didn't know Rick's family detective. That kid of his was troubled. Real troubled. Sarah's pen paused. Tommy. Suspended from school twice that semester. Drugs, they said. Rick was embarrassed, didn't want it getting around the precinct. But word gets out. Hayes shook his head. Kid was dealing at school from what I heard. Imagine how that ate at Rick. Son, pushing the same poison he was trying to clean off the streets. The revelation hit Sarah like cold water. Tommy Martinez, quiet, bookish Tommy who worked at the library, had been a teenage drug dealer. Rick never reported his son's activities. Course not. What father would? But it made Rick reckless, desperate to make bigger busts, like he was trying to balance the scales somehow. Hayes stood and walked to the window, his back to Sarah. Night. Rick disappeared. He got that anonymous tip about the alley. Called it in around 9:30. But here's what bothers me. The tip came to the station's main line, not 911. Whoever called knew the direct number. Sarah felt the pieces shifting in her mind. Who had access to that number? Cops' families, Hayes said quietly. We gave it to our wives, our kids, for emergencies. Sarah drove back to the evidence locker at headquarters as the sun disappeared behind downtown's skyline. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls. She signed for Rick Martinez's recovered items and spread them across a metal table, handling each piece with fresh eyes. The prescription bottle had been nagging at her since morning. That small evidence bag with its rattling contents. Under the bright lights, she could make out more detail on the faded pharmacy label. The patient's last name was visible Martinez. The medication, Valium prescribed for anxiety and depression. The date, September 1978, just weeks before Rick's disappearance. But it was the first name that made Sarah's blood run cold, Thomas Martinez. Tommy. She stared at the bottle pieces, clicking into place with awful clarity. Tommy had been 18 in 1978, old enough for his own prescriptions. The pills weren't evidence of a drug deal. They were legitimate medication for a troubled teenager. But why had Rick hidden them with his investigation materials? Sarah pulled out the photographs again, studying them under magnification. The drug transactions were clear enough, but now she noticed something else in the background of one shot. A figure partially obscured by shadows, someone young and slight watching from a doorway. The image was too grainy to make out features, but the posture seemed familiar. Her phone buzzed. A text from the lab. Fingerprints on radio match victim. Also found partial print on evidence bag. Juvenile record sealed. Juvenile record. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She called the lab tech immediately. Can you match that partial print to Tommy Martinez, born 1960? Already did. It's a match. Kid was arrested for possession in October 78, 3 weeks before his father disappeared. Charges were dropped, file sealed, because he was a minor. Sarah hung up and stared at the evidence spread before her. Tommy had been arrested for drugs just weeks before his father vanished. The prescription bottle, the sealed juvenile record, Hayes's revelation about Tommy dealing at school. It painted a picture she didn't want to see. A son struggling with addiction and legal troubles. A father building a case against the very people his son was involved with. And an anonymous tip that led Rick Martinez to his death, made by someone who knew the police station's direct number. Someone like a cop's son. Sarah sat in her car outside the Martinez house, engine running, heater blasting against the October chill. The pieces of the puzzle lay scattered in her mind like broken glass, each fragment reflecting a different angle of the same terrible truth. Tommy Martinez had been dealing drugs at his high school in 1978. arrested 3 weeks before his father disappeared. Rick had been building a case against the very dealers his son was working with. The anonymous tip that led Rick to his death had come from someone who knew the police station's direct number, a number given only to cops' families. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Elena Martinez. The woman's voice was thick with sleep when she answered. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask you something about Tommy's arrest in 1978. A long pause. How did you... That record was sealed. Did Rick know about it?" Elena's breathing grew ragged. "He found out the day before he disappeared. Tommy's school called, said they were pressing charges for dealing on campus. Rick was devastated, his own son. What happened that night, the night Rick disappeared?" "Tommy came home late around 11, said he'd been at the library studying, but he was agitated, kept asking if anyone had called if his father had left any messages." Elena's voice cracked. "I thought it was just teenager guilt, you know, about disappointing his father." But Sarah understood now. Tommy hadn't been feeling guilty about disappointing Rick. He'd been terrified about what his father might discover. Rick's investigation was closing in on the drug network Tommy was part of. The boy had been caught between his father's justice and his own criminal activity. "Mrs. Martinez, did Tommy know about your husband's investigation? The photos, the surveillance?" Rick kept files at home. Tommy was always curious about police work, always asking questions. We thought it was sweet. A son wanting to understand his father's job. Sweet. Sarah closed her eyes, seeing it all now. Tommy studying his father's case files, learning which dealers Rick was targeting, which locations were under surveillance. The boy hadn't been interested in police work. He'd been gathering intelligence to protect his own operation. And when Rick got too close, when the investigation threatened to expose Tommy's involvement, the son had made a choice. He'd called in that anonymous tip, sending his father into a trap. Sarah found Tommy at the Harold Washington Library the next morning, shelving returns in the reference section. His movements were methodical, precise, each book finding its exact place in the decimal system. The perfect order of a man trying to control a world that had spun out of control decades ago. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her badge visible in her jacket pocket. Tommy's hands stilled on a volume of poetry. His face went pale behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "About what?" "About the phone call you made on October 15th, 1978. The anonymous tip that sent your father to that alley." The book slipped from Tommy's fingers, hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Around them, library patrons looked up from their reading, annoyed by the disturbance. Tommy knelt to pick up the book, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grasp it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your fingerprints are on the evidence bag found with your father's remains. You were arrested for drug dealing 3 weeks before he disappeared. Your father was investigating the same dealers you were working with." Sarah's voice remained calm, clinical. "You knew he was getting close. You knew his investigation would expose your own activities." Tommy stood slowly, the book clutched against his chest like a shield. "You don't understand. I was just a kid. I was scared. Scared enough to betray your own father." The words hung between them like a physical blow. Tommy's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I didn't know they would kill him. I needed them to think I was valuable, that I could help them stay ahead of the police." Sarah felt sick. "So you called in a tip, told them where your father would be. I thought they would just scare him, make him back off the investigation." Tommy's voice broke. "I gave them his patrol route, told them about the surveillance photos. I thought if they could avoid him, everything would go back to normal." But nothing had gone back to normal. Rick Martinez had walked into that alley believing he was following a legitimate tip, not knowing his own son had sold him to his killers. The ultimate betrayal. A father destroyed by the child he'd died trying to protect. Elena Martinez collapsed into her armchair when Sarah delivered the news, her hands pressed against her mouth as if she could push the words back into silence. The living room filled with the sound of her grief, not the sharp wails of fresh loss, but the deeper, more terrible sound of a woman learning that everything she'd believed about her family had been a lie. Tommy sat on the couch beside his mother, no longer trying to hide behind his quiet librarian persona. His confession had aged him decades in minutes. "I never meant for him to die." He whispered again, the words hollow with repetition. "I was 18. I was scared. The dealers said they just wanted to know his patterns so they could avoid him." But Sarah had pieced together what really happened that October night. Tommy's information had been precise. Rick's patrol schedule, his investigation methods, the locations of his surveillance. When the dealers realized how close Rick was to exposing their operation, they'd set the trap. The anonymous tip hadn't been bait for Rick. It had been Tommy's final service to his criminal associates, delivering his father directly into their hands. "They beat him to death in that alley," Sarah said, her voice clinical despite the horror of it. "Used his own radio to mock his calls for backup. Then they buried him by the lake with all his evidence, thinking it would stay hidden forever." Elena finally looked up, her eyes red but surprisingly clear. "All these years I've been mourning a hero, a man who died fighting crime." Her voice hardened. "Instead, I was mourning a father killed by his own child's cowardice." Tommy flinched as if struck. "Mom, please." "Don't." Eleanor stood, her grief transforming into something colder. "Don't ask me to forgive this. Not yet. Maybe not ever." As they sat in the wreckage of their family's mythology, Sarah looked at Tommy one last time. The real journey was just beginning for all of them. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but the truth endures no matter how deeply buried. As she moved toward the door, Sarah heard Elena's voice, broken but determined. "We'll survive this. We have to." "We will," Tommy whispered back. They would step toward healing, toward a future. They would build one painful truth at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.